acts of courage and cowardice in matters of race and justice. Its failure to recognize that all means all, and its schisms and mergers as a Christian Protestant denominational body. How could we? Is there not still urgently before us, even as we gather at this 50th anniversary of the Southeastern Jurisdiction BMCR, the question of, do we still need BMCR? Will it be a prophetic voice, or has it become simply a whining echo? In another place, I have said that African American Methodists are both a remnant of hope and a reminder of the ideal for our church to match its practice with its proclamation. In a later writing in a book I co-authored with Grant Shockley and Karen Collier, I concluded that, quote, I'm quoting myself here this time, this hope was probably based more on pride than reason, more on eager expectations than anything reality suggested, but it was nevertheless a hope, a faith, a gossamer anticipation that sometime, somewhere, somehow, our presence in the church would cease to be the great anomaly that it was. In an even further later publication, just a year or so ago, for the Church History Journal and for the United Methodist Commission on Archives and History, which I'm the vice president, I raised the question whether our African-American relationship with the United Methodist Church is a genuine relation, peculiar though it may be, or is it simply a sentimental affair that has lasted because neither could or dared get rid of the other? Is it now merely a situation of critical challenge or an open opportunity? Will BMCR justify our continued presence with a prophetic voice, or are we left with BMCR simply becoming a whining echo? There's an all-state television commercial that repeats itself over and over, almost ad nauseum, with a man showing up on streets called Park Avenue, Park Street, Park Boulevard. But at the end of each of one of these commercials, we hear this man, this black man, in a sonorous bass voice ask the question, are you in good hands? Are you in good hands? A question perhaps for us to seriously ponder at this meeting. Are we in good hands? From the earliest advent of Methodism, with its peculiar and promising proclamation of the preeminence of grace, to the present, the descendants of Africa in this country have embraced Christianity as preached by the Methodists. The Magnolia missions, the class meetings, the societies, and camp meetings all worked as slaves heard about a grace in one called Jesus Christ that included them in the work of salvation. These disinherited ones said yes to the invitation offered to them by the circuit riders, accepting that they had been accepted through God's amazing grace in Jesus Christ and the scandal of the cross of Calvary. It was for them, as the writer of the Gospel of John wrote, grace upon grace. In 1968, when we gathered in Cincinnati, Ohio, just across the Ohio River, where freedom was available from slavery, we brought together Negro Methodists from across America to address our concern as Negroes in the Methodist Church. We started out as Negro Methodists, but after much consternation, conversation, debate, praying and preaching and persuasion, we boldly and prophetically declared ourselves as Black Methodists and issued our findings, which I helped to write, in a document that ought to be revised, edited, updated with a forward essay, and reprinted in an attractive and colorful binding and made available for study for lay as well as clergy across the church, and for our young people to know who we are, yes, and who they are, and who they can become. Let me help us taste a bit of the flavor of those findings. Quote, "We now stand as proud Black men," we correct that now, "prepared to embrace our blackness and committed to address ourselves unequivocally and forcefully address ourselves forcefully to racism wherever we find it, in and outside the church." And we wrote, "We as Black Methodists affirm and embrace our blackness, and we are acknowledging what God has done, and we no longer wear our blackness as stigma, but as blessing. We reaffirm our belief in God and His church. We therefore have a responsibility under God to bring about renewal in the church at all levels of its existence." And finally, it is a call for us to respond to God's action in history, which is to make and keep life human. But anybody who was present at our founding will agree that it was the words of the rousing and spirited and spiritual sermon preached by my dear friend, originally from Alabama, but then the president of Rush College of Mississippi, Dr. Ernest Smith, that shaped and shook into being Black Methodism for church renewal, and gave us our watchword and our lasting motto. In his words, quote, "From this day forward, our dedication must be deep, our commitment sure, and our action certain. God's work and way are contemporary in every age. Yeah. There is no waiting for tomorrow. It is blasphemous to shunt the expectation from this time to another. Mm-hmm. It is cowardly and without faith to cry that the situation will adjust itself." Mm-hmm. And then those words, "Our time under God is now." A brief review of Methodism and its encounter with the American descendants of Africa may help to enlighten, sharpen, and place in perspective and context our discussion for this morning. On an unusually warm Sunday morning in April of 1787, the history of Methodism in this country would change forever. The relationship of the descendants of Africa who enthusiastically embraced Methodism with basically the British, who preached the gospel as understood by that branch of Christianity, would become an almost soap opera-like saga throughout the rest of American history. On that warm Sunday morning in April, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and a small group of African Americans walked out of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. The exact details of the precipitating incident are not completely clear, but seem to involve members of that group being asked to leave their places of prayer while on their knees around the altar and to return to the racially segregated balcony or some such segregated section of the church recently created for these African Americans to sit. As the event unfolds, Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and a group indicate that if they are allowed to finish their prayers, they will not only leave the altar, but they leave the church and not bother the Methodist Episcopal members anymore. And they left. But some stayed. Some stayed. Some stayed. As humiliating and painful as the departure proved to be for those who left, Allen was candid and clear in his commitment. I'm quoting Richard Allen. As for me, he says, I could never be anything but a Methodist, and I am thankful that ever I heard a Methodist preacher. Allen, of course, would go on to establish and become the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Absalom Jones would be the first African-American Episcopal rector in America. When Allen was asked in 1791 by his fellow members of the Free African Society, a mutual aid society, a self-improvement association that he had helped to organize in November of 1787. When he was asked to form himself and others into the Episcopal Church, he acknowledged the honor, but politely and definitely declined, using the same words. As for me, I could never be anything but a Methodist. I'm glad that ever I heard a Methodist preacher. Allen, a Delaware ex-slave, had been converted under Methodist preaching, was later licensed to preach, and had traveled the various Methodist circuits in Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey with Richard Watcoat, Erie Lewis, and Peter Morath. He enthusiastically, I'm talking about Allen, engaged in these preaching missions to spread the simple gospel of grace by which Methodism was so clearly and closely identified and which he so personally had experienced. Allen undoubtedly moved many by sharing the details of his own dramatic conversion and exhorted others to seek what he himself had found, albeit lost and found. I'll not quote that whole thing, but I'll give you a copy of this, you can see what he said. There's no surprise in what Allen's response to the Free African Society would be when they sought to become Episcopalians and to make him their pastor. As for me, I could be nothing but a Methodist. Even though Allen refused to form the Free African Society into an Episcopal church, the society proceeded to vote to become Episcopalians and to use the building that Allen and Jones had secured subscriptions to build as the African church, albeit with the clear intention of remaining within the Methodist relation. When the Methodist Episcopal Church rebuffed Allen by refusing to supply a minister, he proceeded to move to an old blacksmith shop to a lot he owned and renovated it to become a place of worship. But always a Methodist place of worship, of course. Allen, in recounting the situation later and explaining his view about the offer, added these words: I was confident there was no religious sect or denomination that would suit the capacity of the colored people as well as the Methodists, for the plain and the simple gospel suits best for any people in the world. Richard Allen's staunch loyalty to Methodism and his tenacious commitment to the particular and peculiar Wesleyan understanding and expression of the Christian faith is but one dramatic example of the fierce loyalty, fidelity, and extraordinary bond that has characterized his and so many millions of other African Americans in their devotion to the Methodist Church from its very inception. Although Allen left the Methodist Episcopal Church to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the new church was thoroughly Methodist. I'm talking about the AMEs. Thoroughly Methodist in its doctrine, in its polity, in its theology, in its hymnody, in its worship, and in its practice. Other African Americans who departed at a later time were to follow Allen's pattern and practice. James Varick and Peter Williams from the John Street Church in New York to form the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And a few years later, the Black Methodists who petitioned the General Conference meeting in New Orleans in 1866 after the Civil War, those who were in the Southern Church asked the General Conference if they could become a church, and the General Conference, the Southern Church, voted, and they became, in 1870, in Jackson, Tennessee, the CME Church, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. And in 1954, they changed the name from the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church to the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in 1954. What can be said of the presence of Africans in the founding of the Christian church when it was born on Pentecost, if you read Acts chapter 2. What can be said of that founding of the church, the Christian church, at Pentecost can be said of Africans and the founding of Methodism in this country. They've been a part of the Methodist Church in the United States from its very beginning. In fact, the two Antiguan women that Wesley baptized in Bristol in 1758, elsewhere in my book I call them the Nameless Two. They can be credited with being the first, I'm talking about the two women that he baptized in Bristol, and they went back to Antigua. They can be called the first Methodist in North America. First, black. The first Methodist were black in Antigua. These two were so moved by the simple gospel of grace that John Wesley preached that they went home and converted their master, Nathaniel H. Gilbert, and then they returned to Antigua to establish the first Methodist church in this hemisphere. It was not in Baltimore. Amen. It was in Antigua, where those black women converted Nathaniel Gilbert and they established the Methodist Church in Antigua. When Methodism spread to the United States, Annie Sweezer was there at Sam's Creek in Frederick County, Maryland, with Robert Strawbridge in the first meeting of the First Methodist Society in colonial America. 2 years later, Black Betty was present as one of the 5 people in New York when Philip Embry held the first Methodist service at Barbara Heck's house. Several black subscribers were on the roster of membership, paying their part when the John Street Church built its first meeting house in 1768. In addition to Black Betty, there was Margaret and Rachel and several other African servants who were on the list of contributors to fund the building of the first John Street Chapel. Richard Allen and Harry Hoosier were at Loveland Lane in Baltimore when the Christmas conference was convened to organize the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784, although they were there as lay preachers, as were most of the people who came to the General Conference in 1784. Black Harry, as he was familiarly known and referred to by his associates, had gone up and down the East Coast with Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, spreading the news of the impending organizing of the Christmas conference as the horsemen for the Lord. Harry Hoosier, born a slave near Fayetteville, North Carolina, around 1750, heard the eminent British Methodist preacher Francis Asbury preach and was converted. He was soon licensed to preach, although he could neither read nor write. He refused to allow Richard Allen to teach him. He reportedly told Richard Allen that when Allen offered to teach Black Harry how to read and write, here's what he said to Allen: I sing by faith, pray by faith, and do everything by faith. Without faith in Jesus Christ, I could do nothing. I'm fine. Those who were quite literate, as well as the scholars and journalists of his day, testified to Harry Hoosier's utterly amazing eloquence and ability, and to what his professed faith apparently enabled him to do. Abel Stevens, in his first volume of History of the Methodist Church, quotes one of those learned observers' commendation of his preaching ability. Dr. Benjamin Russ often talked about Harry as the best preacher in America. Bishop Thomas Coke paid perhaps the highest tribute to Harry Hoosier in these words, I'm quoting him: in his story of the beginning of Methodism in America, which does not give a prominent place to Harry Hoosier, familiarly called Black Harry, is inadequate. Surely he deserves a place in Methodism's Hall of Fame. By the time the Civil War split this nation into northern and southern fragments, with the church divided into corresponding regional parts, there were over 200,000 African Americans who claimed fierce loyalty and utter devotion to the Southern Methodist Church. That number was reduced to a little more than 78,000 in 1866, owing to the numbers of Black Americans who defected to the African churches as the Union armies opened up new territories for the northern African American evangelists to crusade and urge these Black Methodists to join the independent churches as a badge of their freedom. I'm trying to put this in perspective for you. But even in the face of the implications and the contradictory realities, we remain in the church. We remain in the church, both north and south. And probably all would have said, as Richard Allen had said 75 years earlier, as for me, I could never be anything but a Methodist. And I'm thankful that I ever heard a Methodist preacher. We who are gathered in this room this morning are part of that group whose descendants are the African American constituency of the contemporary United Methodist Church. We are the heirs of Harry Hoosier and the makers of Zoe. We are the loyalists and the remnant who became a church within a church, and about whom the question is whether there is the need for that group, us, a Black Methodist from whom this caucus was formed. The question is whether or not we can renew the church, whether we can be in reality a prophetic voice, or whether time, a few changes, some promotions to higher offices, and a few racial cross-racial appointments have dulled our witness. But we consider our task virtually completed, or whether we think we live in a post-racial society. If we so surrender and succumb to such palaver, then the fearless voice in the wilderness will now become simply nothing but a whining echo in the corridors of time. I'm going to repeat that.
Yes. Go.
I worked on that.
You worked on that?
What I mean?
Yes, sir.
I worked on it. If we so surrender and succumb to such palaver, then the fearless voice in the wilderness will now simply become nothing but a whining echo in the corridors of time. The initial strong stance the Methodists took against slavery is well known. The fact that the church compromised its principled position is even better known and has had far more serious consequences. It hardly escapes our minds now that the nation was able to come back together long before the church was able to find a way to be reunited, and even then at a very expensive price to the African American Methodist constituency. The price of demeaning and insulting racially constituted segregated central jurisdiction. The dissolution of the central jurisdiction and the creation of the Black Power movement only partly account for the organizing of Black Methodists for church renewal. But it surely led Dr. Smith to reach into his New Testament background and to provide us with our motto and our watchword. Our time under God is now. But in our present day, when truth is on the scaffold, and lies proceed out of the mouth of him who occupies the residency of the White House, when the church is faced with its contemporary problems, and the right-wing evangelicals, and even those in the United Methodist Church, who call themselves evangelical, even those right-wing say that they are the only Christians. BMCR is as a caucus of the United Methodist Church must seriously ask itself, our time under God is now, but time for what? Huh? Time for what? And that is the question that this annual meeting must seriously and thoughtfully and prayerfully consider and address. Time for what? When BMCR was but 2 years old, John, you remember this. When BMCR was but 2 years old, we confronted the call session of the General Conference in St. Louis in April of 1970 with our concerns about the history and the role of the church in matters of race and justice. Forming a ring around the entire body of the conference in that auditorium, I was there, and John, I think we were there. We as Black Methodists and some white folks who shared our concerns urged our church to take action. And it did in some ways, which I do not want to minimize. But it is to the resolution that a white clergy delegate from Indiana made that passed that I call our attention to as still our time now and our reason for BMCR to continue to exist. Leroy C. Hodak, who came from Indiana, he was a delegate to the General Conference. He was later elected bishop. Bishop James K. Matthews was in the chair. Hodak got up and said, Bishop, I want to make a motion. And Bishop Matthews ruled that he was in order. And here's the motion that motion of a resolution that he proposed. Here are the words. So hold that. We, as the United Methodist Church, need something, speaking to BMCR, need you, BMCR, to provide our institution with life and spirit.
Yeah.
You hear that?
Yeah.
We need you to keep us honest. We need you to keep us responsible. We need you to keep us humble. We need you to keep us concerned. And we need you to keep us Christ-like. In brief, brothers and sisters, right on.
Yes.
That was his motion. That was his resolution. After an overwhelming affirmative vote, the words of Bishop James K. Matthews rang out in that auditorium to a thunderous applause. Hear the words Bishop Matthews uttered. It is done. Well, the resolution was done, but we're not done. Not done yet, BMCR. We're not done yet. Racism is still alive, well, and living in America and around the world, and masquerading as free speech, right-wing populism, science, American religious values, and the will of God. We're not done yet, BMCR. The church, even our church, is still the most racially segregated place in America on Sunday morning. No, BMCR, we're not done yet. Our voices are still suppressed. Our votes are still suppressed. Our people's names scratched from the voting rolls. Their applications waiting in the death drawers of the opponent. And our people are turned away from the voting roll as if the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments would never pass. We're not done yet, BMCR. No, we're not done yet. Our women are mocked, intimidated, shamed, and told they're lying when they tell the truth about how and when they have been sexually abused, racially and economically discriminated against, and overpowered with loud, angry, mean, and disrespectful male voices. No, BMCR, we are not done yet. Our black men and boys are arrested, beaten, jailed, and killed just because they are black and male, and because they don't matter. They don't matter. To the police, they don't matter. To white people, they don't matter. The women, white women, can't even allow the black man to use the key to open his own house without being killed. Black men don't know, BMCR, we are not done. And we're not done, and we will not be done until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, and all flesh shall be able to see it together. We will not be done until all really means all, and all of God's children can sing together and pray together and eat together and play together and live together and love whomever they choose to love. We're not done until the earth sees justice roll down like water. We shall keep on working, and keep on praying, and keep on preaching, and keep on protesting as a prophetic voice, crying in the wilderness, prepare the way standard.